Hello, everyone. My name's Alison Turnbull, and I'm a law academic based in the UK. I'm based in the law school at Birmingham City University in England. And I wanted to do a short talking head to tell you a little bit about some of the findings from a doctorate in education that I recently completed. And it's all about assessment feedback in higher education. So you can see the title of my PowerPoint there, which is Feeling Feedback, Screencasting Assessment Feedback for Tutor and Student Wellbeing. So there's something of a focus here on well-being. So I did my research for a doctorate in education rather than in law, based at Nottingham University in the UK. And in the end, I had two research questions. The first, as you'll see there, was looking at sort of a broader question, which was looking at tutors' feedback values and practices. So what was happening to feedback practice in this sort of shifting context of higher education, which I'm sure is different in different countries, but I'm sure that we're all on shifting sands, no matter where we are on the globe. The second research question was sort of a response to that concern, if you like, in the first research question. So I mounted an intervention talking to tutors and students about their perceptions of working with audio-visual feedback and seeing if there were any affordances and limitations around that, the screencasting or audio-visual feedback. So what I've done is just put together some of the main takeaway messages that might relate largely to tutor as well as to student well-being. So I'll just take you through a few of those and just do a bit of explanation around that. So this was the first research question. So looking at contextual change and how this might affect assessment feedback practice. So there was the first research question again. And I think the two principal messages that I had a lot of data, having talked to some tutors in my law school in the UK. The first message was really around professional dissonance, and I suspect there's not too many surprises here. I had quite a lot of data describing contextual changes, such as it says there, rising student numbers and the concomitant workloads, but also more nebulous things like managerialism and so on. And there was a lot in the data there to sort of back up the ideas in the literature. So, for example, that these changes are leading to what David Nichol writes a lot about feedback, and he calls impoverished feedback dialogue. This challenge of trying to get effective feedback out efficiently when you're dealing with large numbers. Caroline Strevens, who is another legal academic in the UK, says that in some cases this leads to obstructed values. So there was some evidence that some of my tutors were feeling their professional values were in danger of being compromised because of the contextual changes they were facing. The other main message, I suppose, I've chosen to talk about here really is about marketisation. In the UK, certainly, we've seen significant changes over recent years in relation to students now having to pay tuition fees of in excess of £9,000 a year. And it was interesting that there was some perception on the part of the tutors that feedback was being seen more as a product rather than a process. So that might also lead to feedback challenge and complaints. And we have data from the complaints body in the UK which suggests that there are sharp rises in feedback challenge, actually particularly sharp in law as well as medicine and business as well. And some of the tutors talked about that as leading to something of a deprofessionalisation. They felt that this was something of an assault on their academic integrity and autonomy. So if that was the first question, which was kind of looking at that context and seeing if there was a concern around those sorts of contextual changes. The second question was looking at what could be seen as perhaps a partial response to those concerns. Looking just very specifically at how we might use audio-visual or screencast feedback, like I'm doing now, to see whether or not there was any potential there for meeting some of those concerns. So what I've done is just set out some of the practical dimensions, and then on the following slides I'll talk a little bit about the pedagogical consequences perhaps of screencasting, and also something about the relational and the affective or emotional dimensions to it. And in the research study that I did, I talked to both staff and students. We had some audio-visual feedback that was given to about 375 students. And I had a small group of 16 students that I held focus groups with, and they completed contemporaneous online reflective journals, as did the tutors. So we had interviews, we had focus groups, and so on. So it was a case study. So we were looking to triangulate this data. So what did it tell us? What were the main messages coming out of an intervention where we used screencasting to give feedback? Well, in practical terms, my data tends to back up an awful lot of the literature which suggests that tutors can actually save time, and of course this can be an issue for tutor well-being. And it wasn't just that we could save time, we could give more feedback in that time. As far as the pedagogical consequences of that, it's quite interesting to see that the tutors not only gave more feedback, but the quality or the nature of that feedback changed quite significantly. And again, most of the literature suggests that this is so. When talking, the tutors talked about giving more feed forward. They felt they had more time to do that. They could give more explanation. And they tended to to step away from saying, oh, put an apostrophe here or whatever. And they tended to step back and do more global comment around how the work could be improved. The students actually felt that the feedback that they were getting was far more personalised. They felt it was far more individual to their work. And the consequence of that had quite strong data that the students were engaging better with this type of feedback, partly because they had to work with it in a different way. They weren't just reading. They were having to listen and make notes and all that kind of thing. And they were very often describing how they were listening to it multiple times. And perhaps most significantly, off the back of that better engagement, they were describing better understanding. Of course, I didn't measure that. This is entirely based on sort of qualitative perception. But I think that is potentially significant, which is all great news. Any issues, though, that might be attached to that? Well, the tutors talked about loss of structure in their feedback. They felt if they were writing feedback, that they could fill in the boxes on the sheet, or they could feedback and structure their feedback the way in which they wanted to. So they felt that there was a danger of loss of feedback message. Maybe they couldn't, for example, separate out the feed forward into a separate box and pop that in. But one of the tutors just described just structuring and pulling down their points and just talking about them at the end. And the students said they didn't feel the structure was an issue at all. So that was quite an interesting division of opinion there between the tutors and students. But one other issue that did rear its head was in relation to students for whom English was a second language. We had 6 international students out of the 16. And they described perhaps some difficulties in dealing with the spoken word, not knowing how a word was written, and because tutors were perhaps being more conversational and using more, not slang, but perhaps nuanced language, that this could produce difficulties perhaps for students for whom English is a second or additional language. So those are the sort of practical and pedagogic dimensions. I was particularly interested in the literature around the socio-affective dimensions of using screencasting. And it was particularly interesting that I was looking at all of the findings and analysing them during periods of lockdown across the world. And we were doing more and more screencasting at the time. So a lot of the findings I was trying to share in my university at the time, because we felt that there were potentials there for belonging and reaching out and creating connections with students that we weren't able to get into in a room with. So in terms of the relational dimensions, interesting data around changes in the tutor's tone and language. All of the tutors said they thought they were being more encouraging, and they all said that independently. They were using more encouraging language. and their tone was more encouraging. So I thought that was quite interesting in itself. That switching from the written word, they felt one of the tutors talked about very often writing in a cold way, but she felt she was much warmer when she was speaking. She felt more of a connection, and I felt there was particularly interesting data around these issues here. Both parties, both the tutors and the students, felt a sense of presence of each other, a sense of audience, if you like, even though this was completely asynchronous. This was not happening live at all like this. It's a recording. Perhaps you feel I'm present to you now. There was also feelings of connection, and the international students in the sample gave particularly strong data that they felt more of a connection with the person who was giving them their feedback. And there was some evidence as well that as a result of that, they felt more cared for, and that was across a number of the students. And the sort of the pastoral potentials that flow from that, I think, are particularly interesting. There's very little data on this, but one of my tutors mentioned particularly that the student she had given screencast feedback to, there was a higher number coming to her seeking pastoral help, not just clarification on the work, pedagogic help, but actually pastoral help. In some ways, they felt they met with her, and therefore there was a social distance perhaps that had already been covered. I thought that was genuinely interesting. And because of these relational dimensions, part of the focus group activities we did was to look at how this might affect engagement. And there was data to suggest that the students felt that feeling closer to a tutor, feeling more connected and perhaps cared for, meant that they were far more likely, they said, it's not me, they were saying they're far more likely to actually act on the feedback, which is interesting, which goes to show, of course, doesn't it, what an emotional business this is, which is why I sort of came upon this phrase of feeling feedback. I think we all know this from our own days as students, that we can be buoyed up and encouraged by feedback, and we can be crushed and wounded by it as well. It's just a question, of course, how you respond to that. So it's not just about understanding feedback, it's about feeling it, and that might affect the extent to which you act on it, perhaps. The students did, unsurprisingly, give me data around what Ed Pitt has called emotional backwash. This sort of the backwash that you get from feedback, and it might in some cases stop students from acting on the feedback. Part of my focus group activities was getting students to record how they felt on receiving their screencast feedback. These were the 3 most popular adjectives. They were able to choose their own. So they felt encouraged, supported, motivated. We did have reference to boredom as well for particularly long files. And I'm sorry I've gone on for 13 minutes already. I'm sure there is an element of human boredom creeps into this. And we also did an exercise where the students said whether or not these emotions would make them more likely or less likely to act on the feedback. And I think this is particularly important for screencasting, because of the students were identifying more positive emotions with them. They said that these sorts of emotions would positively affect their feedback engagement. So they were saying that all of the emotions they felt, other than boredom, and there was a small number of students that were saying they felt bored, all of these positive emotions, if I can call them that, would lead to better engagement on their part. And once again, I thought it was particularly interesting that this emotional dimension of feedback was particularly strong in coming from the international students. And we also had one student who had a lifelong neurodevelopmental issue, which didn't affect her cognitive abilities at all, but did leave her with genuine anxiety issues. And she had never accessed written feedback, never accessed it, because it set off her anxiety. But she did access her screencast feedback, and she felt very encouraged by it. And I interviewed her separately, obviously with ethical clearance, and she felt that there were very particular emotional affordances for students who might be dealing with anxiety issues from whatever source. So I hope you found some of that interesting. If you would like to contact me and discuss it further, I'm very, very happy to. I'm still in that honeymoon period of having just completed my doctorate, so I'm very happy to talk to you about it. You can find my article, Feeling Feedback, in the Law Teacher International Journal, if you'd like to have a look at it in a bit more detail. Or feel free to email me at this BCU address if you like. If it is after the end of October 2022, there is my personal email address, because I will have retired by the end of October 2022. So all good wishes for your teaching and your assessment, and indeed your feedback. Best wishes, and bye for now.